This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
Okay, I think my pressing question for you, given your work, is maybe I want to say, what do people get wrong about eschatology, like in American Christianity? I mean, if we could just talk about American Christianity as a cultural phenomenon, or maybe what do they misunderstand about it? I mean, I guess it could be both, but like, what's the fundamental complicating factor when you just want to have a normal biblical discussion of the end times?
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, so there's a lot of things that I would say to that, right? And I think the primary problem I have with modern American, typically Protestant, evangelical sort of approaches to eschatology is that it's very me-centered. It's as if the entire Bible had no meaning, especially Revelation had no meaning until the 21st century, right? Or whenever. And I find that deeply problematic. I mean, there's a hubris there that I think needs to be tamed a little bit. And so that's a thing that I run into a lot. And in fact, it's nothing nefarious. It's nothing, overtly arrogant at all. Because I remember growing up in these circles thinking that way, but I wasn't doing it consciously as arrogantly, right? When I speak of like me-centeredness, I mean that primarily hermeneutically, not ethically per se, right? Like,
what do you mean by hermeneutically?
Yeah, like meaning we interpret things as if it's only about us, as only having meaning within our horizon of understanding, kind of thing, and we have nothing more to learn in that respect. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, and so I remember being a kid and just being completely terrified at a lot of these sorts of things. There was a lot of fear going on, for example. I mean, okay, if you just go back into the 90s, I mean, there was lots of fear about the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
And it was almost the sentiment in popular circles that was like, you need to beware because you could accidentally take the mark and then damn yourself.
I accidentally got it tattooed on my hand.
That's right. Accidentally. But it came in more regular everyday events, such as like you get a driver's license and there are 3 6s. I can't remember where I read this, but it was from a reputable source. I think it was from who was the one? Bill was his last name, not G.K. Bill, Timothy Bill maybe. He wrote a book called Revelation, a biography. Highly recommend it. It's a short little book, but I think it was in that book where he talks about Ronald Reagan, who, I guess after his presidency, he moves wherever he moved, and his house number was 666. and so they petitioned to have it changed because it just, it has this sort of, there's a cultural lore and mysticism about this thing that even people who may not be, writing on the topic or whatever, they're still terrified of the number, or at least the perception of it. So that's what I mean. Everything was just so focused on the events of the day, whether it was driver's license and, it was barcodes and social security numbers. Now you're getting into nanotechnology.
It was national ID for a hot second there, but we.
Oh yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when you stop and just take a step back and you plot the narrative, what you see here is as technology develops, so do the speculations, right? And so I think that's just data we need to understand. Well, anyway, as I was writing the book, was reading and reading what commentators were saying, and there were people, specifically someone like Craig Keener in his commentary, he notes this. He talks about how I think it was in the 16th century, 17th century, where some early Baptists were very much speculative in this approach too, right? So all to say, I think even Christopher Columbus, I think I quote him with respect to him. Columbus, as I recall, one of his motives was to participate in the new heavens and the new earth, and somehow he paired that with his voyage. Anyway, So this is not a recent phenomenon. I'm only, talking about American Protestant Christianity because that's what I know. It's what I grew up in. But it's not reduced down to just our era or our culture. This has actually been a longstanding issue. And I think at the root of that, I'll say one more thing and I'll be quiet. But like at the root of that, I think are good intentions typically. I know as a Christian, I really want the world to be fixed, especially raising kids in this crazy world. Like I need something to be fixed. And at the heart of our Christian faith is the return of Christ, who will come and bring about judgment or fix all the things that are wrong and right all the wrongs. And so we tend to approach the text with that sort of anticipation. And that's fine. That's good. In my opinion, every generation has a right to expect the return of Christ, but we need to do so in a way that's disciplined. And unfortunately, I don't see that sort of discipline among modern prophecy teachers as much as there should be.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to air before this podcast, which one's going to get pushed, but I just had a conversation with Brent Strawn, who's an Old Testament professor at Duke, and we talked about intertextuality and the use, and where does 666 come from, right? And that it's actually a throwback to Solomon. So if you think about like contextualizing not just your generation, but the biblical conversation on the end times, you have to kind of understand, like it becomes almost impossible to imagine somebody accidentally getting the number of the beast on their forehead or whatever. It's this very willful act. And, in some ways, you don't want to poo-poo people's real sensitivity to, like, I want to make sure that, almost like in the judgment, I want to make sure that I am not only on the right side, but I haven't let anybody else down with me, right? So like you said, it's a good impulse. But I guess, part of the question is, how does I'm going to call it the American religion of Christianity, which can be distinguished from other flavors. How does it maybe overread the end times into its daily practices, and what's commendable and what's not there? And I think of, and I'll be quiet, but the one example I have, I was just talking to someone here at Oxford who said, "Yeah, I grew up watching Jack Van Impe." And I happen to know exactly who Jack Van Impe was.
Me too. I watched him too.
Yeah, when I was a new Christian, I watched him and I was like, "What is going on here?" And I consider myself a fairly skeptical person, but after a little while watching him, I'm like, I don't know, maybe am I missing everything? Jack Van Impe and Rexella seem to see it so clearly. But what's the impulse to overread? I mean, I'm sure I was a pastor for a long time, and the number of older people who said to me, I know everybody says it, but I really do think Jesus is coming in our generation. And I would just say, well, we're closer now to the end times than we've ever been before. So,
right.
What do you think is the impulse there? Again, that what's commendable and what's not?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. One is, I know for me, this is anecdotal, but I suspect it's true for a lot of people, is that we all want our Christian faith to be real, right? Mm-hmm. We want it to, we want to see how it's real. Maybe that's right. A better way to put it. Maybe. Vindicated, exactly. And so when, say, a certain thing happens in the Middle East, right, and you can go find, I mean, I'm sure your listeners know, you can find wars in the Bible that occurred in the Middle East, right? And so, and prophecies about wars that will occur, and so it's a real easy correlation. You can find places in geography. It all sort of coalesces. And if you're not careful with your reading of Scripture, you can look at the evening news and then, and then have the Bible in your lap and say, okay, I see how this is working, and you can put two and two together. And that, so I think that's part of it. And the motive there is to see the Bible's true, and so I think that factors in specifically with respect to living in America. I think a lot of it is, don't mix politics and religion. I'm going to do that just for a brief second here for a moment. But in America, we are, the predominant superpower, and we have been for a while. So we've got our hands in just about every place, mm-hmm. and especially in the Middle East. And so the things that happen in the Middle East are going to be spoken about more here, especially after 9/11. And so there is a heightened sort of element with respect to just the Middle East, right? And then that factors in what I said earlier. So I think it may just be a mix of a sincerity, an understandable motive to want to see our faith justified and vindicated, mixed with the accidental fact that we live in America that happens to be in this time of history, this predominant superpower who's doing a lot of stuff in the Middle East. So I think it's just a combination of factors, perhaps. There's lots more to be said, I think, but that's probably the basic.
Yeah, it's funny. Even though I lived in the Middle East and I traveled there often, I forget America's kind of has a unique obsession. Not entirely unique, but it is a boutique obsession with the Middle East and all things Middle Eastern. Okay, so you're a biblical scholar. You work in the New Testament. Let's talk about some text and think about, and I mean, it's not entirely true to say Rapture's theology is a fairly new American theology, but there are some facets of it that are new and there are American. So when we think about, let's start with what happens when you die. What are things that we can say are absolutely clear and nodal in the biblical authors thinking about what happens when you die? And then we can move on towards the eschaton.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I
want to think minimalistically here, things that we could all affirm and say this is true. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say most Christians are going to say that after you die, you're in the presence of the Lord.
Right.
If you're a Christian and you're absent from the body, present with the Lord. And I know there's a lot of mystery related to post-mortem existence in a number of ways, but that's probably the gist. Is that kind of what you're aiming for there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a mysterious on it. Like, I actually don't know what happened or what presence of the Lord means entirely, but
it's fair enough. Yeah,
I'm in the Sheol Hades camp, like whatever that means.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
And so then I guess what's the problem in the biblical art or the New Testament? I mean, I think I want to say biblical, but we'll say in the New Testament storyline because more people are going to be familiar with that.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we go from there? Okay, so we're dead, we're in the presence of the Lord, or we're in Sheol, we're awaiting. So what happens next in the timeline?
Well, I think this is where everything breaks down. So my background's philosophy. So when we're combining the ideas of post-mortem existence in a spiritual realm, and then you use the word timeline in the same sentence, I'm like, okay, how does time work in that respect? Right. And so I tend to ask more questions with respect to that. So I don't know. I mean, what's happening? How are our loved ones experiencing existence in that moment versus how we're experiencing it in this moment? They're really, so I don't know how far you want to go on this, but when it comes to post-mortem existence, it's really fascinating, actually. Whether you look at Thomas Aquinas, he had a whole way of making sense of how the dead can come back and visit the living.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he did. I mean, it's fascinating. It's a little section in the Summa, and so he talks a little bit about that. But it's actually something that Saint Gregory of Nyssa and Saint Macrina, they're talking about in the treatise on the soul and the resurrection. They talk about and they're actually riffing Plato. So Plato in the Phaedo, he's talking about, why do people see ghosts in cemeteries? Well, it's because their spirit hasn't detached completely from the body and it's being weighed down by the body. And then so years and years and years later, when St. Gregory and St. Macrina are talking about this, she adopts that same idea. She doesn't talk about being weighed down to the soma, but being weighed down to the sarx, which...
So soma is body and sarx is flesh. Right?
Flesh, yeah, which in Pauline thinking typically can mean sinfulness, like they're weighed down. My point is to say this, post-mortem existence, at least in the early Christian tradition, it's kind of mysterious. And so I can appreciate a mysterious approach. And so how all that sort of works, I'm not entirely sure. I don't really address it in the book, but I should write a book on that one day. That'd be fun.
Yeah. So at the resurrection, because that is, if we think timelines, things happening before you have to die before the resurrection, although some will be alive in the resurrection.
Yeah.
What happens in the resurrection, in your view, and why is it important to the story of what God is doing?
Yeah, that's a huge topic. I think that's often missed, and this is where the Hebrew Bible, I think, it comes in handy, right? Where Well, I tell my students a couple of things. One, eschatology is Christian eschatology is a competing eschatology. It's meant to compete with the cultural eschatologies that may be floating around, whether the first century ones, Platonic ones, or the ones whatever exist today. But I also say that, look, if you want to understand the way in which Christian eschatology competes, then you have to have a good protology. You have to have an understanding of protology, right? The idea of the creation stories and why creation is actually important, and this gets into all sorts of debates about the soul and nephesh and the idea, what does it mean to be embodied and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
But we could work it out at kind of a creation level rather than anthropological. What is a human level, right?
Right. Yeah, creationally, I think this is the thing to keep in mind, is that God creates creation in a way that's beautiful and good and functioning in good order, that falls apart due to human and spiritual rebellion, and so this is where Christians often go wrong, is that, okay, it's fallen apart, we are sinful, let's confess our sins, say the sinner's prayer, whatever you want to do, and then you get to go to heaven when you die, right? And then, and N.T. Wright and others, of course, he's not the only one, he's right to push back against that and to say, look, no, the Christian vision captured in the Lord's Prayer is that God's kingdom come, that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and that's the final vision of Revelation, namely the unity between heaven and earth, adorned as N.T. Wright points to this imagery a lot because it's right there in Revelation, that it's a bride and bridegroom situation. They come together in one. And what God has brought together, let no person render asunder, right? And so, but yet in our eschatology, we rip those two apart. That earth is just going to the trash heap. But thank God we're going to heaven. And what in the world does that mean? We're going to float on a cloud wearing a toga playing a harp, I guess, right? But that's not Christian eschatology. That's not the way we compete with the viewpoints in the world. To summarize, it's just the biblical story, as I understand it, is that God renews everything that was destroyed by sin. And that includes the physical created order. So why the resurrection is important is because it brings about that fact that God wants to restore all things, and he will.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that when we talk about end times and the kind of intermediate state, that the emphasis of the biblical authors seems to be much more on what happens at the resurrection and beyond. And they seem to be fine being fairly silent on what happens in between, with just little brush strokes to intimate, you're in God's care at that point.
Yeah.
For better or for worse, you're in God's care,
yeah.
Right?
Right.
And so I think that there's questions about, like, I always think, like, okay, well, if your soul goes to heaven when you die, then does your soul have to go back down into the material world, into the realm, in order to be resurrected back up? Like, is it like planting seeds back in a new flower?
Mm-hmm.
You have to say, because they're silent, you kind of have to make up a story if you want to fill in that silence. And that's where you get Dante and all kinds of fluid stories about what happens to you when you die, that have probably had an outsized impact on the way we think about death, the devil, judgment, etc.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of questions, and we do fill in those gaps more than we realize that we do. And sometimes we fill in the gaps with very unhelpful assumptions. And some of them are, you can't help but to do that. And, I don't really want to speak where the Bible is silent. I mean, I tell people all the time, because I actually get this question sometimes. Well, what happens after, is there a purgatory, and how would that work? And my answer to a lot of these questions is, I don't know. I haven't died yet, and so I can speculate for you, and I can point to scripture. But here's what's interesting. Some have pointed out that Paul may be speaking more into the intermediate state than what we realize. So, case in point, Gerald McDermott, he's an Anglican priest. He wrote a book.
We've had Gerald on podcast before.
Oh, have you? Okay, I want to meet him. I really want.
That's great.
Him. Okay, cool. Yeah, you'll have to connect us or something. But it has a great little book. Deep Anglicanism is what it's called, published pretty recently, and he he talks about this question of purgatory, like what do Anglicans believe about purgatory, and he kind of goes into all that. But he mentions Philippians, a passage that Paul talks about in Philippians, where he says, he who began a good work in you will complete it. When? At the day of your death, right? No, at the day of the Lord.
Right.
So he skips death. But I grew up in a Protestantism that always taught, you die and you're immediately fixed, completely fixed.
And you know everything.
And you know it all, like you've got it all down. Yeah, right. And I don't think that's actually correct. And I think Gerald's on to something when he mentions this. He's not dogmatic about anything, but he just kind of mentions this as like, there's more here than we realize. Paul is definitely doing something that we don't do with respect to that question. And so, how does all this work? I'm not entirely sure. I just haven't been dead yet, like I've said. But I do think that there is room for thinking creatively about this, right? Some sort of like purgatory-like concept, is actually, it's a pretty old concept. I mean, you read Second Maccabees, for example, right? Post-Mortem atonement kind of thing. And so, and the other thing I would say real quick is, I teach Revelation every year. And in fact, that's what I'm teaching this spring. And there's a scene in Revelation where the martyred saints, and I know it's all imagery, so I'm not kind of trying to plot much on a timeline here, but there's a scene where the martyred saints are under the altar, and they're asking God, like, how long? They're praying the line from the Psalter, how long until you fix everything? And that's such a revealing prayer for the dead to be praying. Is like they get a sense that it's not fixed yet, and I find that interesting. The resurrection, I think, is important in this respect too. Is that as I read Scripture, I tend to think that we all experience bliss at the same time. That I would say that our loved ones who've gone on, they're completely safe in the presence of the Lord. And so we shouldn't worry about them, right? But it's okay to, even though they're safe, but it's okay to still say that they're still waiting for something. They're still waiting for embodiment and resurrection. And so, interesting, in a lot of churches, most Christians believe what I've just described,
Right.
so
most Christians throughout history around the world believe something like this. Yeah,
absolutely. They do. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Why? Well, you're comforting me because this is what, when people are like, well, if you don't know what happens immediately once you die, then how do you comfort people? I'm like, well, I do funerals as well. I'm ordained. Right. Yeah. And I say, well, whatever grandma is doing, she's safe in God's hands, and she, like us, is awaiting the resurrection, right? So we're kind of all in the same boat.
Yeah.
In some ways, you wish we would join ourselves to the saints who have gone before us and have the same expectations.
That's right. And I think, a true story, my wife, we talk about this kind of stuff all the time because her mother actually passed away. It's been a while ago, over a decade ago, but it was such a sudden like death, from an illness that we didn't think it was that she would die from. And so it's a very, very big shock. Very, very traumatic in the way that we found, the way when it happened and how it, And so anyway, long story short, this is something we routinely talk about. Like this is, and the thing is, my wife and I, we're not the only ones, right? Like everybody. Well, I tell people this: the next funeral you go to will either be your own or someone that you love and care for, or somebody that you care for. And so death is something that we should think about. And one thing, some of our conversations that my wife and I have is we readily admit that there's a lot we don't know, and we embrace that mystery in the context that God is good and loves us and loves our family members. And one thing we often say, again, I don't know where to go with this, but we often say and comfort one another with is like, we don't, how do we know that they don't see us or that they don't, what I mean? And that actually that's not unbiblical or anything. And it's brought comfort to us. And we don't know that's the case, but you can't help but think this. And when you go to your worship service and you're worshiping God, you're joining your voice with the angels. and those who are standing before the presence of God as well. So I think it was an Eastern Orthodox thinker or whoever said that the veil is thinnest in your worship service, right?
Mm.
When you're with the saints, all of them,
It sounds
communion
like
of saints.
Simon.
Yeah, I don't know who it was. It might have just been a Facebook meme. I don't remember, but yeah,
I'm an Orthodox priest.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what interested me about death, and I'm now hearing your first statement about me-centered eschatology, end times thinking that's me-centered. What's going to happen to me? Where I'm at? Which is not a wrong question to ask. I mean, I think this is what Jesus puts to the Sadducees: like, are you even worthy to enter the age of resurrection? Right? He flips the question kind of on them when they give him a little puzzle.
Yeah.
And so that's a relevant question. But, for Christians, that's kind of a settled question, and the confidence in the work of the Holy Spirit and Jesus on our behalf. And then after that, we're entering a world. It's not a world that is where we're not the main character. We're who we always should have been, which is one of the elect and one called in and one who can. I got all kinds of ideas that what might happen, like you said, speculating in the end times. And but one thing I've actually become more confident of, and you can tell me if you have any hesitations here, is that history continues and learning continues. And there's kind of an inexhaustible richness to reality that won't be exhausted just by me being a super, I'm not going to have a giant head where I can hold all facts or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't have any hesitation with that. In fact, that's what makes the afterlife and the new creation so appealing to me, is that life goes on, that history, who said that, I think he made a comment, maybe it was N.T. Wright, I don't know, history doesn't end. There's not this rupture.
Yeah, that sounds like Tom.
Yeah, right. But there's, and in terms of our encounter with God, let's think about this. I'm a classical theist, right? So I ascribe to all the classical notions about God, and he's infinite, and he's infinite in all ways, power, knowledge, whatever. And to stare in the face of the infinite is not something that can be captured in a moment's time or in 100 years. I mean, it's literally an infinite sort of relationship, and there's no reason in my mind to doubt that we will continue to learn about God and to learn about God's creation for all eternity. And it's really hard to grasp the concept of the infinite, but God as the true good and the beautiful. I mean, this is going to be bliss in ways that we cannot imagine forever.
Yeah, and I mean, Esther Meek, who was one of my philosophical mentors in seminary, she just talks about the inexhaustible richness of your spouse. Right? Like it's, I can guess what my spouse will say and say, like, I think this is how Stephanie would respond to that. But she still surprises me. And I've been around her for, 27 years now. And I think, and that's just somebody like who I live with, how much more so God and creation, at large. So it is exciting to think about that, devoid of all the, pain and tears and et cetera.
Yeah.
We can think about other questions like, can you break your leg in the new creation?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, again, I have kind of artistic riffs that maybe I could think about, but
yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to turn to your book and say exactly. So the book, It's the End of the World as We Know It, famous REM lyric. It's a great title because I can't even read it without hearing the song cue up in my head. And if you don't know the REM song, you should go on to YouTube or whatever. And
my only regret is that when you open it, it doesn't miss the song.
One of those cards.
Like one of those cards.
It's the end of the world. Yeah,
that's right.
That would have been epic.
Yeah, I'll talk to Lexham about that.
Yeah. Why? Well, yeah, they're the logos. They're the technology people. They could absolutely. Lexham,
they could do it.
Listen to me right now. You need to make this happen. At least one volume at SBL next year.
Oh, that would be cool. Yeah. Anniversary edition.
So what made you want to write that book? What was burning inside of you? And then what do you think that book does?
Yeah, allow me to blame my wife on this one. So this was in 2020. Pandemic kind of stuff was going on, and there was lots of fear, obviously, understandably so. I remember being afraid, like, what is this, the Black Plague? That kind of thing. But inevitably, what I was seeing on social media was a lot of speculation with respect to the end times, Mark of the Beast stuff, one world government, all of that stuff, coupled with this pandemic thing that was going on.
Wait, was the vaccine? Did people think that this was the mark of the beast?
Yeah, that was part of that
chain?
conversation. Yeah.
Okay.
And so I would read this stuff, and I would complain to my wife, and she's like, "Well, write something on it. You should." I don't want to.
Don't just sit there, do something about it.
That's right. I didn't want to, and I told her that. And so finally, our wives are always right. So I succumbed to her wisdom, and so what I did is I literally grabbed my iPhone and I just opened the notes tab, just wrote something up, posted it on Facebook, and it was shared widely, very widely. And it resonated because what I was doing in that little article thing was talking about the mark of the beast. Here's what it is, here's what it's not. And I think it helped people. And so a buddy of mine who was working at Logos at the time, in Faith Life, at Tavis Bollinger, he was an editor, Tavis, and he messaged me. He's like, "Hey, can we put that on the Logos Academic blog?" I was like, "Yeah, sure. Let me tweak it for that audience." And so we did. And so he posted it, and at the time, it was the most read article in the history of their website. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but it really resonated, and so it got quite a bit of readers, and then the questions came. Lots of questions. I think at one point a commentator called me an agent of Satan because I don't know. I guess I'm on Bill Gates' payroll. I don't know. Which would be nice actually. But
I would be in for that.
So anyway, given the comments, I wrote a second follow up, and it did well too. So Tavis is like, "Hey, how quick can you pop out a book?" And so we did, and that took a few years and stuff, and because I had to kind of delay it because I was writing my Paul book by the time that contract came in. So long story short, this one came out in February of 24, but it had been written quite a bit before then. It just came out at that point. So it was purely pastoral. I don't know how else to put it. Revelation, eschatology really wasn't on my radar, and so I did it. I just wrote it. I wanted it to be something that anybody could read, but I wanted it to be informed, because one of the things that frustrates me the most when I go to my local bookstore is they have a prophecy section. It's huge prophecy section, and my book is never on that shelf. So maybe I'm just speaking out of a little animosity or whatever. But all the books on there, 99% of them, it's just, it's one of these, a book every 6 months by these people, and there's no research in it. There's no engagement with the Greco-Roman, none of that, and it really frustrates. So what I wanted to do in my book is remedy that, is address all the questions those books are addressing, but point people to either ancient sources or good commentators. And I want it to be a bridge book. So that was my motive for it, and I think it was important because I just address basically 7 questions that people are asking. It's not meant to be a complete exhaustive view on the end times, but just to hit those questions and to push people to do 2 things. Number one, engage the text, go to the text, ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And then secondly, be willing to set your assumptions aside for a moment. And I tell the reader, you can always get your assumptions back. You can always put those lenses back on, but just for a moment, travel with me to Laodicea and Thyatira, and then just go with me. And then if you're not convinced, that's fine, but let's engage the text and the data. So that was the genesis and the motive behind the book.
And thinking in terms of like, I was going to say famous/infamous passages, like the Left Behind passages. Do you get any pushback? Oh, maybe we should clarify the dispensational reading of Left Behind passages versus what I think most people would consider the normal reading. Yeah.
So the basic idea is in passages like, Tim Lahaye, for example, he identifies the three big texts that argue for a rapture. Okay, and that's 1 Thessalonians 4, John 14, and 1 Corinthians 15. And the rapture is this idea that at any point, like today, tomorrow, whenever, Jesus will come back and take you. He doesn't like all the way come back, right? He kind of, I guess, into the clouds, takes you, the Christians into the clouds, takes you away for 7-ish years. And then for 7 years on the earth, the Antichrist comes. There's a tribulation that lasts 7 years. And then at the end of the 7 years, Jesus comes back, beats up the Antichrist, locks up Satan for 1,000 years. There's a literal 1,000-year reign. And then Satan is released back on the earth to do a lot of bad stuff. And then you have the final battle, right? And then the eternal heavens and new earth and stuff. So when you look at those passages that speak supposedly of a rapture, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is like the go-to passage in all of these prophecy teachers in their books. Tim Lahaye, John Hagee, and John's son Matt Hagee, I believe. Yeah, Matt. They all kind of point to these texts. And when you read them, I mean, I get it. Like it talks about coming on the clouds and taken away and that sort of thing. But what we have to do, though, is we have to, again, this goes back to the me-centered approach. And again, I'm not suggesting people are consciously being arrogant. It's hermeneutically me-centered, right? And so we need to ask the question, bracket ourselves away for just a moment, ask the question, what would the Thessalonians have thought about this? And are there other passages in antiquity or texts in antiquity that say something similar? So what you do when you find out in 1 Thessalonians, for example, is that the word that Paul uses for going out to meet the Lord in the air, this is a word that Josephus actually uses. And typically in these contexts in the Greco-Roman world, the idea was that when a royal figure or some sort of dignitary diplomat, when they would come to your city, it was customary to go out of the city to meet them, to go meet them miles away or whatever, and then escort them back as like a parade. It was to show honor. Nowadays, it's hard to conceive of that because Air Force One just like plops itself down in the middle of the city, right. And then but back then they didn't have airplanes, right? They had chariots and horses, and it was a long journey, and you could anticipate. And so you'd go out and to meet them, and these are the same words. Josephus uses it's the same root word, a slightly different version, but nonetheless, the same word that Paul uses. And nowhere in 1 Thessalonians 4 does it say you're taken away to heaven.
Right, because the question is, okay, now that you've met, where are you going next, right?
Exactly. So this is what I pose to the reader. All it says is, you'll go out to meet the Lord, and so you will be with the Lord forever. It doesn't say where. And so so what we have to do is this. The reader must bring assumptions to the text. There's no way around it. Okay, now the question is, which assumptions are better brought? Modern ones about rapture theology, or the way in which the assumptions that Josephus had and other people had when they use these words, right? And I would say, if I'm going to put money on it, I'm going to go with that ancient understanding, right? And so what this would mean, though, is that you don't have a rapture in the sense that the church is taken from the earth, so that the earth goes through this time of thlipsis, a tribulation, right? And so you don't have that. And so it seems to me in my reading that when Jesus comes back, he comes back and he puts his feet on the ground, and then you have the kingdom, right? And so, yeah, that's an example. I just want to
point out, because you made a little comment earlier. Sorry, I didn't mean, that sounds petty. You made a comment earlier about, I don't want to combine politics and eschatology or religion here.
Right, yeah.
But everything we said is political, right? It's a king.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Victorious king in this case. And yeah, I think...
and that's a modern construction, by the way. I'm just being, funny, kind of poking fun at our modern sentence, but there was no difference between politics and religion in the Greco-Roman world, right?
So, absolutely fused.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess to give a flavor of this, it would be like if you told your kids, I'm going to go pick up your father at the airport. It's kind of embedded in that phrase that you're going to pick them up, bring them back home, right?
Yeah.
And we don't even have to finish the thought and we can ask, where are these people going, right?
So many of the texts in Scripture are elliptical, meaning like there's a lot of gaps that are assumed and presumed by both the reader and the writer. And we, living in the 21st century, may not always have those assumptions, so we have to do a little extra homework. And that's not, I know the pushback here is, well, so I have to learn Greek to even read my Bible?
Right.
No, I wouldn't suggest that at all. I mean, no, you don't have to learn the original languages. You don't have to be a scholar to get the gist of it. What I'm suggesting, though, is that just question your assumptions and use those resources that are out there, because the truth be told, when it comes to like these prophecy teachers, talking about the mark of the beast or whatever, I don't know any. I just don't. This is just a fact. I don't know any reputable biblical scholar who thinks the mark of the beast is a vaccine. I just don't.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Now, I let me caveat this too. There are reputable, really good, great, smart scholars who believe in the rapture. I will say that. So I'm not suggesting otherwise. But again, I'm kind of doing the work of a historian, and I'm just laying the data for the reader, and you can decide for yourself there. But
Yeah, we could also do the work of literary scholarship, where we just read along the grain of the text without any knowledge. So I think of like Luke 17 and the parallel version, and Matthew 25. I always forget if it's 24, 25. The Left Behind passage, where it opens up as it was in the days of Noah, as it was in the days of Lot, right? So it will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. And then you just have to follow the logic of the text, right? So in the days of Noah, who was left behind and who was swept away? In the days, who was left behind, who was swept away? And in Matthew's version, which I think is the one more people are familiar with, it doesn't ever clarify. Luke's version, the disciples ask, well, where did they go? And he says, well, wherever the vultures are, there the corpses gather, right? And you're like, okay, we don't want to go there. Wherever they're,
right.
We want to stay with the left behind people.
That's right. You want to be left behind. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So in that case, it's just there's a structure to the text that seems to be followed pretty coherently across the Gospels, where it's just gotten inverted. So it's funny that it was, I remember a seminary professor walking through that passage with me, and like all of a sudden you see it, you're like, oh, the left behind are the good ones. Like that's where we want to be, right?
Right.
Also, little things I found, because when I go on tours of Israel and Palestinian territories with students, where you're at Megiddo or you're near Megiddo, right? And you just go, oh, Armageddon, right? Har Megiddo. This is a place where the battle happens, and you can see people's brains melting. Like, what do you mean Armageddon? This is it? It's like, it's that little hill over there. With the flat top on it. You said there was a competing world of eschatologies, and timelines. So what was the Greco-Roman competition, I guess, in the running the Christian story, the Jewish story, maybe we could say the very early Jewish Christian story, is competing with?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say that there were multiple different eschatologies. We could look at. Of course, Plato is an easy target in the sort of Platonic traditions, namely, the spiritual goal. The body's kind of bad. Again, read Plato and the Phaedo, right? The dialogue there, and the body definitely seems to be a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason is because the body can deceive us, right? I mean, the eyes can deceive you. When you put a straw in your cup of water, the straw's not broken or crooked. So but there's something about the mind that perhaps is better knowledge. 2 + 2 = 4, right?
Because they had pure access to understanding before it came down, right?
Yeah. So you definitely, overall, just very simplistically, you get this sense that the body's sort of bad. And so I think New Testament eschatology would compete against that and say that no, the body's flawed. The body is sinful, if you will, but it will be fixed and redeemed, and that's an important feature. But I think I think what I'm most interested in, going back to politics here, I think looking at the Roman imperial cult and the way the church, lots of debate about the church's relationship to empire, and I don't get into all that, but I think that that's always been really interesting to me. I think at the heart of Christian eschatology is that it's very different than the way of the Roman Empire. In Roman Empire had this idea of Pax Romana, that the emperors could be worshipped. Upon death, an emperor could be deified by the Roman Senate. It only happened after death, right? Well, in Rome it did, but in the Greek-speaking part of the world, they tended to worship emperors while they were alive. But anyway, so with we tend to think of. Let me back up. When we think of eschatology, we tend to think of the final events, right?
Mm.
The final things that happen. And I think that's a mistake, because I think eschatology is about a person. Like, Jesus is the first and the last. He is the eschaton. And so I think the most important question is who's in charge of the world, who has been, who is, and who will be. And I think when you look at Revelation, you have you have a competition of sorts that's laid out in the narrative, namely a dragon with his beasts who are opposed to this slain lamb. And one would think that the slain lamb is going to lose this battle.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've never even seen Game of Thrones, and I could call that.
That's right. Yeah. And so, but the whole thing is subverted, because the might of the Roman imperial system, is conquered by this slain lamb and by the lamb's people, right? The saints who are martyred. Even, in fact, it's through their martyrdom often that they conquer, right? And so, in fact, the funny thing about Revelation is that you're kind of anticipating this big battle at the end, kind of a Lord of the Rings thing. This huge army on the left, huge army on the right. And it's kind of a letdown in that regard, right? Because the king shows up and he sword in the mouth. It's not literal, but what does he do? He just like speaks a few things, and so
scares people.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Scares people. And I think the question was who's really in charge here,
Right.
And so I think. I can't help but think that the early Christian movement was a political movement. I'm not trying to suggest that I hate using those terms. How do I put this? It's political in a cruciform sort of way, right? I think that's the best way to put it. And I think that when it came to understanding the world, I think the early church needed a reveal, a revelation, an apocalypse. They needed to see that, okay, mighty Rome, actually behind mighty Rome is a dragon, nothing good, right? And our king is the one who brings true peace. You had the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, but our king brings the true peace. And I think for early Christians, that's what they were looking for. That's what they were waiting for. And for John, he's telling a story of how when the king returns, he'll subjugate the beast and he'll take care of the beast. And hopefully people will get on board with that program,
Yeah. And this is as you're saying that, it just strikes me, this is a very old storyline in the Hebrew Bible. You can go back prior to this, but certainly Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
We know what you see on the battle lines drawn. We know what you see, but the bows of the mighty will be broken, right? And the feeble will bind on strength, which Mary rehearses the same poem
in the Magnificat
about Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of sense of the upside down kingdom, the unexpected, the weak are made strong, the strong actually are only strong visibly, and they're not ultimately strong. I'm thinking about a new liturgy for the next presidential election, like run up to the presidential election should be, maybe something like First Samuel, Daniel, Ecclesiastes, and Revelation. Because people who are really wondering, does the earthly political order, is this all there is, right? And if it is, then that's creates
the question.
Certain anxieties, right?
Yeah. That was the question of the first century. Is this all there is? Are we forever subjugated? And here's the crazy thing. Like in the early Christian movement, I don't think the message to the church was just wait.
Right.
I think it was more like, wait, and in your life today, here's how you conquer today.
Right.
And I think we have to keep that in. Again, it goes back to the Lord's Prayer. How do we flesh out the kingdom here? Jesus talks about the kingdom is near, it's here, it's in you. And I think that Christians all too often and I throw myself in this category because I get bummed a lot about the state of the world. But I think we need to recapture the power and the potency of loving our neighbor as ourselves, and in embedding ourselves in our local communities, doing good. That's where it happens. It's not going to happen in a way that we often think. It doesn't typically happen through power. I mean, people do. We read the book of Daniel. God puts people in positions of power, and I don't want to deny that at all. But we should never deny the power of what it means to serve the people around us and the love of Christ and the little things.
Yeah, and even Daniel, right? You get me in the Hebrew Bible, and
let's do
my
it.
mind starts lighting up. But even Daniel, who has this kind of this earned and some unearned power, he uses it to save the lives of his fellow magicians and wise men. When the king wants to kill them, right? He steps in and says, "No, okay, I'll interpret. God will interpret this dream for you."
Yeah.
So you don't see this kind of abusive, coercive form of power, even
That's
there. Good. Okay. So that is the book, "The End of the World as We Know It." Is there a subtitle to that?
What the Bible really says about the end times and why it's good news.
There you go, with Lexham.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm traveling, so I don't have my copy of the book in front of me. Okay, so now I want to ask you, I don't want to abuse too much of your time, but I do want to ask you, like, is there anything you're working on that you're thinking about that's kind of like out of the box that you want to think out loud with us, and maybe even if people have some resources or some things to think about or reactions for you that you want to put out there?
Yeah, no, it's good. I always have writing things going on, and like I'm trying to, play with a lot of ideas. I'm working, at IBR this past year, I gave a paper on wrath and Revelation, and my background's philosophy, so I was using a language game approach from Ludwig Wittgenstein in assessing the concept of wrath and the language of wrath and Revelation. So I'm prepping that to send off to a journal or something, and I don't know, do something with it. And but one and there will probably be. I'm working on I'm in conversation with the publisher to do a follow-up book to the End of the World book. It'll look a little differently. It'll be a little differently, but I want to approach it. I want to answer some different questions. And
so it's not like going to be the beginning of the new heavens, new earth, or something like that.
No. It's going to be. I want to. Yeah. How do I put it? It's not. So this book was like, okay, here are the top 7 questions we're all asking. Let me give you some answers. This is going to be more of an artistic approach to living life in light of the eschaton.
Yeah.
So it's like bridging the gap. It's kind of like what I said about waiting and living, that kind of thing. Yeah. So that's going to be my approach. I'm also super interested in, and I'm starting I don't know how long this will last, a pretty big research project on so I'm super interested in religious experience and paranormal experiences that people have, and I talked to a lot of people who have really weird experiences, right? I'm working on a project with that, and I'm going to try to tackle that subject with some of my own training and background in hermeneutics and philosophy and of course biblical studies too. So it'll be a fun thing. I'm really excited about it, I think, and we'll see what happens. But yeah,
so kind of a biblical theology of how to interpret weird things that happen to people.
Yeah, exactly. We were talking earlier about Dale Allison's book Encountering Mystery, published by Eerdmans, and he's a professor at Princeton Seminary, and I encourage everybody to go read this book. He's a well-known scholar, a highly reputable scholar, and he does a lot of fun work. And he wrote this book about his own experiences that he and his family have had, and just looking at some of the open source material with respect to things like near-death experiences, and I mean the whole gamut: miracles, prayer, that kind of thing, visions, angels, and he's had some pretty remarkable experiences, and I always appreciated when people like him talk about this topic, because I know a lot of people who have either had experiences. I mean, I've had an experience, and I know people who've had experiences, and you don't want to talk about weird things because you don't want to seem like a kook, right?
Right. And it also like
you
is
know.
in that subgenre. It feels like it's in the subgenre of telling people about your dreams. It's
Yeah.
like sometimes
Yeah.
it seems inherently uninteresting unless you were there, you know?
Unless you were, well, that's the thing. I mean, like a lot of people have experiences that cannot be proven, but they're
Right.
very real to them.
Right.
And so Allison talks about a pastoral imperative that he says we need to be talking about this because, you know, he has this line, I forget the exact quote. He's like, you know, people think we're kooks. People think, but he's like, some of us, right? We have a right mind. You know, we are employed to use our mind on a daily basis, and we know exactly what it is we experienced. And so, don't ridicule us, right, for just reporting these things. You know, and we have to remember the way science works, and this has been interesting in my research. The way science works is that sometimes, you know, the truth can lie within a myth, right? I forgot the guy's name. His last name's Newman. He wrote a fun little article on gorillas, and one thing I didn't know was that the existence of gorillas wasn't confirmed by Western scholars or Western scientists until like the 19th century, and which is fascinating. And so he talks about how, though, I think his line is the truth often starts within the realm of the myth or something like that. And so, but it's important because prior to the confirmation of gorillas, there were rumors and myths and stories and tales of humanoid monsters in the jungles of certain parts of Africa that lived in huts, and they would steal your women and they can slay elephants. The whole myth, right? And so you would dismiss this, right? When you confirmed that there were actually humanoid type creatures that we now call gorillas, you can see that many of the rumors were false. They don't live in huts. They don't steal women, and they don't slay elephants. They're actually that we know of, right? Maybe at night, but they're actually kind of shy. They're actually shy creatures, is what it comes out. But there was truth in the stories. There was truth in the myth, right? And so, as my understanding, I think meteorites were the same way. Like, I think Craig Keener mentions this in his book, the 2-volume set called Miracles. And basically, scientists shun the idea that rocks fall from the sky. Everybody knows rocks don't fall from the sky. Lo and behold, I guess the people that were reporting this were right. Rocks do fall from the sky, and we call them meteorites. And so I'm really interested in the question of science. And so, like, and scientific revolutions, and like the Kuhnian revolution, like Thomas Kuhn, and his, what's the name of his book? Structures of Scientific Revolution. Yeah. I remember reading it in undergrad and just taken by, and I recently reread it. And I think that, like, we need to understand that science is constantly going through paradigm shifts, and there are often, with every paradigm shift, there are always pushbacks. There are always the naysayers, even within the scientific community, but that's just kind of part of the process. So, long story short, Dale Allison made a comment that I resonate with. He said, look, I just came to the conclusion that the world is much stranger than my science teacher told me. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you can't, when you look at this culturally, people are interested in all sorts of paranormal things. And now I'm a confessional scholar, so I believe the stuff I write about. I believe in Christ and all sorts of things. And so my whole aim is pastoral in this whole regard. I just want to help people know that, you know, you can be an Orthodox Christian, conservative Christian, and still make sense of your experiences. And what I'm doing in this project is looking at one subset of what we might call paranormal experiences. And so I'm going to look at a certain type of experiences. But anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
But the next book will be Bigfoot, right? Cryptozoology.
Yeah, I might do Bigfoot. Why not?
Yeah. I mean, Bigfoot, which, you know, it's kind of like the unicorn. If you, to a child, describe what a unicorn is, it's a completely reasonable animal. I mean,
why not?
Yeah, I mean, there's a narwhal, right? If you describe a narwhal to somebody, it's... So even something like Bigfoot, I'm like, I don't think he actually exists, but there's nothing actually that unusual. And I've even heard in the evolutionary science stuff I worked on, you know, like, it is possible that there is some kind of strand of hominid that managed to stay around for a long time, longer than we would have maybe thought. So
or it stayed around a long time, not here today, but it went extinct 500 years ago. That so yeah. And I mean, the octopus is such an interesting animal in this regard too, because isn't it the case? I'm not up on zoology or anything, but like I think people who study that part of the world would say that an octopus actually, their evolutionary line kind of went on its own little thing. Yeah, it's not even part of the traditional sort of line. I think that's correct, but I don't know. I watched that. Was it Netflix? My Octopus Teacher. Which,
I didn't do that.
Oh, you should go see it. It sounds so dumb, but when you watch it, like I loved it. Like I think I watched it twice. But to me, and I'm a hermeneutics guy, and by hermeneutics I mean not how do you just interpret the Bible, but just how do you understand anything? How do you understand anything?
Art, newspaper articles, etc.
The whole game. It's a subset of philosophy, the philosophy of understanding. It's not epistemology per se. It's the philosophy of understanding. And so I say all that because I felt like that documentary was kind of a course on hermeneutics, and you just have to watch it to know what I mean by that. But yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Well, Dr. Matthew Halsted, thank you very much for guiding us on this rip-roaring discussion about the end of times and the beginning of the new heavens, new earth, and cryptozoology.
Thanks, man. Drew, you rock. It's always fun to talk.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.